Welcome to the podcast, Restore Yourself, Restore Your Marriage, where it's all about discovering the thoughts that get you in the mood, the thoughts that get you out of the mood, and how creating a deeper connection with yourself creates a deeper connection with your spouse. I'm your coach, Shelly Anderson, coaching you through life, love, and intimacy. This is episode 199, Inducing Intimacy. Well, happy Mother's Day to everyone. Today is the day after Mother's Day. And it's really interesting because I usually love to do a podcast episode about mothering and all the different forms and all the different ways we can think about it. And last week, I heard a song from a guy. It wasn't a song I was super familiar with on the radio. And he ended up using words that are very related to being a mother and birthing things. And I was like, what in the world is happening with this song? Because here is a guy talking about birthing. And I was like, okay, this is very interesting. Of course, I immediately became very intrigued by it. And this is kind of like the message of what he was saying. He said something like, I birth new lyrics. Yeah, I induce it. So I probably don't have it exact because, like I said, it wasn't a song I was super familiar with, but it really got me thinking like, here is a guy who is getting the concept of birthing something, of mothering something, of creating something, giving new life to something that did not exist before. And I was like, yes, I love this. So, of course, I wanted to relate this to intimacy and the concept of inducing. I loved that he used the word induce. And it's not a word that we use a lot outside of like pregnancy and trying to start the birthing process. I don't even remember the last time I used the word induce, unless it was related to this process of starting the labor process. And so as I was thinking about this, I was like, oh my gosh, the challenge that we are facing, and a lot of the couples that I work with, is that we often are not in the process of creation. We're not in the process of like bringing to life our sex life, the intimacy that is taking place. And so we feel victims of the sad estate of our sex life. And so for husbands, that might be like, hey, we're not having the sex life that I dreamed of, right? The frequency is not what I imagined. And then for the wife, it might be like, man, where's the romance? Where's the beauty? Where's the emotional connection? Those things are missing. It feels like those things are dead, right? And so we feel like we have no say in what is happening. We feel very much helpless to make the change and give life to what it is that we are actually longing for in our intimate relationship. So we feel helpless and we often feel hopeless as a result. And when we feel hopeless, we often don't take any action, or we keep taking the same action that we've been taking for years, which is probably not giving us the results that we want. Now, I often hear from women when I work with them, I'm just not interested in sex, right? This topic of interest comes up a lot. And even with husbands, they're like, my wife's not interested in this, like zero interest. And so I really love the concept of interest. And you know what's really interesting? We all know what it means to have intercourse and to have sex. It's not like a word that we're probably going to look up the definitions to. But I do find it very interesting that one of the definitions of intercourse and sex is to make something interesting, to make something appealing. And so if sex is not interesting to a wife and to a woman, we got a little work to do. And it doesn't have to be hard. It doesn't have to be boring. It can be quite fun, quite entertaining. It can be funny. It can be romantic and sexy. It can be whatever we want it to be. We get to birth what that looks like. We get to create what that looks like. And when we're involved in the process of creation, it's actually fun. It's actually exciting and invigorating. And it gives us life. It gives us motivation. It gives us that energy. So a lot of times when we think, oh, I have to do some work, I have to put some effort, we think that it's going to be draining and hard. But when we actually involve the process of creation, it's the opposite experience. It's fun. It's lively. We like doing it. So if we can just give our brain this little challenge of, hey, like let's induce intimacy. Let's give it life. Let's create it. Let's be the origin of what that looks like. Man, that is going to feel very different in our bodies. It's going to change the experience. And why not do that? Let's get involved in that. So what do we do if we actually want to induce intimacy and give birth to something sexy in the relationship? Let's start with just a few definitions of what it means to induce. It means to bring about by stimulation. It means to cause something, to affect something. It means to cause the formation of something and to move along by persuasion or by influence. Now, what's really interesting is that if we really look at what actually happens when we have to induce labor, induce the birth of a baby, there's a reason for it, right? Doctors don't just go around saying, let's induce all the babies. That's the new procedure. When we induce a baby and we induce that process of labor and delivery and that birth, there's a reason. And the reason is usually like there might be a danger coming up, and we might need to induce the labor to take place at an earlier stage of the pregnancy. But also, we may need to induce a labor because it's not happening when it's supposed to. Now, I have personal experience with being induced. So I have 5 children. 2 of them are adopted. But my other 3 kids that I was actually pregnant with and went through labor with, I had to be induced with all 3 of them. My body did not go into labor when it was supposed to. Like I was going way past my due date, and the doctors were definitely concerned about my health and the health of the baby, especially because my babies kept growing and they were getting big. So I have definitely been involved in the process of being induced. And so I thought it would be really interesting to just look at the steps of what it means to be induced and how that can relate to intimacy. Now, the first step of being induced is to ripen her cervix. Okay, and I want to just read to you what that means. It means that sometimes I'm probably going to say this wrong, the prostaglandins, versions of chemicals the body naturally produces, are placed inside the vagina or taken by mouth to sin or soften, which means ripen, the cervix. After the prostaglandin use, the contractions and the baby's heart rate are monitored. So you've got to ripen the cervix. You've got to get it ready. You've got to soften it. So how is that going to relate to intimacy? Well, we also have to ripen the woman's cervix. We have to make sure that we advocate for this process as like, hey, this is the starting point, and we need to consider arousal. And before I go into that a little bit more, I want to give you the example of a client I had last week. I'm just going to call her Emily. And she said, hey, I was really thinking about some of the things you were talking about in your podcast. And she said, my husband was in the mood, right? He got aroused and he came to me and was like, hey, look at me. I'm in the mood. I'm aroused. I'm ready to go. And it happened so fast. It came at a time that she wasn't expecting it. Her body, because it's not like a man's, did not get aroused just because her husband said, hey, I'm aroused, right? There's no on off switch for a woman when it comes to arousal like it is for a man. So she, at that point, just made the decision of, hey, I'm going to do my good wife duties and I'm just going to have sex with my husband because he's aroused. So what she ended up explaining to me was that the whole experience lasted less than 2 minutes and she never got aroused. Her body never went into like the physical state of arousal, which means her cervix wasn't prepared. Her body wasn't prepared. She never lubricated. Lubrication wasn't used on purpose. And so she ended up having sex that sucks. And in fact, not only did it just suck because she didn't have any pleasure, but the opposite happened. She actually had pain. She said she got a rip in her skin during sex. And so it was stinging during the process. So when she had this experience, she was like, man, why didn't I speak up? Why didn't I say, hey, like, let's get my body aroused first? Like, she felt bad afterwards that she hadn't advocated for her own arousal. And she said she really learned from that. And it was kind of like a, hey, note to self, make sure, even if it's in the heat of the moment, that you do advocate for your own arousal. Like, hey, like this doesn't have to take an hour. If we know the steps and we put them into place, it can actually happen fairly quickly for women as well. And I find it very interesting that a lot of times we hear the analogy of like men and their arousal, like they're like a microwave, right? It happens fast. And women are like a slow cooker, right? It's the long brewing process that's going to take hours for her to be ready. And unfortunately, this analogy is inaccurate. Yes, if you don't know what the process is, if you don't have a system that you're using that you know works, if you don't know the steps and the order, you don't know the process, if you are missing those ingredients, yeah, it's going to be really hard and it could take hours. But listen, if you have a system, especially the system I teach, you know the ingredients, you know the process, you know what the recipe is for female arousal, and you just put them in, it doesn't take hours and hours. It can actually happen quite quickly, and it can happen like a microwave. The problem is most people are operating without the system, without the key ingredients. So yeah, it does take long. But imagine if you just had the right ingredients. This is a game changer. So we really need to make sure we know what these ingredients are. We know the system. So if we are going to really induce intimacy, and step number one is to ripen her cervix, we got to make sure we know what that means. We got to make sure we're using a system that's an all-inclusive arousal system. Most couples are functioning from a female arousal excluded system. It's being left out. So, of course, it's going to take longer and seem like it's just so much work. Why do that? If we function and operate from an all-inclusive system that includes female arousal, man, it is so much more effective and usually a lot faster. And it doesn't take as much effort. Like, why aren't we doing that? So, just like when we induce labor, we need to ripen her cervix. The way that we ripen a female cervix when it comes to intimacy is we need to ripen her circumstances. What? That seems like a big stretch, but this is so key. How do we do that? Well, just look at her circumstances. Ripening, if we remember the description had to do with softening it, right? Softening the cervix. We need to soften the wife's circumstances. And this is an easy process, right? Just look at her circumstances in the moment and say, okay, what's one thing we could take off her plate right now to lower her stress? Stress is the biggest blocker to a woman feeling the desire to have sex, and therefore it also blocks her arousal. And if her body's not aroused, she does not have a good sexual experience. It's not pleasurable. It's usually painful. Now, if we can just like look at her circumstances and say, let's soften those up a bit. Let's just take one thing off of her plate. A husband can do this. If he doesn't know how, guess what? He can ask. He can ask his wife, you know what? What's one thing I could take off your plate? But also a wife can do this for herself or advocate, right? She could say, you know what? Could I just get you to do one thing for me really quick? It would be so helpful, right? She can make that request. And if the husband like can't do it right in that moment, maybe he's like, you know what? I could do that in 10 minutes. I hope that for all husbands listening to this, they would learn to recognize that if a wife is saying, hey, could you help me out with this one thing? Could you take one thing off my plate? That is also a request of, hey, I would love to get in the mood for intimacy. And I'm working on it. And maybe I could invite you to help along in the process. And I hope husbands would look at that as like an invitation, like, yes, she is advocating, she is asking, and this is how we can move this process along. She's showing me how, she's telling me how. So that's a really positive thing. Okay, step number 2. When we want to induce actual labor, right? The second step is to strip the membrane. What does that mean? It says stripping the membranes, the doctor or the nurse would sweep a gloved finger over the covering of the amniotic sac near the fetus. This separates the sac from the cervix and the lower uterine wall, which can help start labor. So I had to go through this. I remember they had to start stripping this membrane that keeps things attached. And so there has to be some help to create this separation. And we have to separate the membrane, which acts as a protective layer, right? This protective covering, and it's trying to protect the fetus that's inside. Now, we're going to have to do something similar. If we are going to induce intimacy, we are also going to have to strip a mental membrane. And that means we're going to have to create some type of separateness. So we do this by taking a closer look at those negative thoughts. And we also are going to have to strip away at them, right? Create some separateness. And we can do that by really asking ourselves, like, what negative thought am I holding on to that's trying to protect some precious part of myself? That's with that's within, that's inside. And usually we're going to find that we have some thoughts that are trying to create these walls, these protective walls, to protect our feelings, right? We do this a lot. We are afraid to feel negative feelings. So we put up a lot of walls, we have a lot of coverings and a lot of things to try and say, keep out. I got to protect my feelings. So, how do we do this, right? Again, husbands, ask. Ask, like, what are you thinking about right now? What's on your mind? What's troubling you? What's stressing you? Being able to just ask those questions takes the guesswork out of the picture. You don't have to wonder. And your wife will appreciate that you're asking about her thoughts. And for the wife, again, advocate. You can just really say, you know what, I just have something that's on my mind and I'm having a hard time being able to put it out of my mind, which makes it really hard to think about getting in the mood. And so as you're able to really discuss that with transparency and just say that you are advocating for this process of stripping away this mental membrane, this negative thought that needs some separation. It needs a little bit of help in order to create that, right? So we can get to that, the precious cargo that's inside, right? The feelings. Okay, step 3, when it comes to actually inducing labor, is to break the water. It says with this technique, the healthcare provider makes a small opening in the amniotic sac. The hole causes the water to break, which helps the labor move forward. So the water that's inside the amniotic sac gets released, right? And that needs to happen. Labor doesn't happen unless that takes place. And that's going to be the same for us. It's going to be really hard to move into being aroused and move to intimacy and creating intimacy if there's not a release of the water. Now, what does Shelley mean by that? Right? The release of the water, the tears, the emotions, right? Sometimes it is so simple as just saying like, I feel, and then you just name that one word, emotion. I feel stressed. I feel confused. I feel anxious. I feel sad. There can be so much relief of these waters, these emotional waters, in that 3-word sentence. So women, advocate for the relief and the release of your emotions by using this 3-word sentence. It's so simple. You are putting that out there in the universe, right? But probably to your spouse saying, I feel this. And just that sentence alone can bring so much relief. And then it gives your husband a chance to respond like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I had no idea you were feeling that. Now, this leads to step number 4, the final step to induce an actual baby. It says that you need to inject some medication, right? And here it gives 2 things that you can inject into the woman to help induce the labor. And both of them are hormones. The first one is Pitocin, which causes the uterus to contract. Or the second one is oxytocin, which it actually says here it's more effective in speeding up the labor. Okay. So what does this mean for intimacy? Well, we also need to inject a certain type of medicine, right? But not with a needle and not through our veins, not up inside the cervix, but it's mental medicine. Mental medicine. This goes back to our thoughts. Our thoughts are so important. If we have just released and expressed a negative emotion that we have been holding on to, right? That's keeping us from wanting to be intimate with our spouse. we're going to need to now replace that with something that is beneficial, that's helpful, right? We're going to need to inject mental medication in the form of a new thought that is positive, that is helpful, that is inviting, a new thought that the woman likes, that she's interested in, that feels vibrant and full of life, that's motivating. And if you look at these two different types of hormones, the Pitocin that causes contraction, that's probably not one that we're looking for. We don't want to cause more contraction and withdrawal. What we're going to want to focus on is the hormone of oxytocin. That is the cuddle hormone. That is the love hormone that exists between husband and wife, right? So this gives us an opportunity to just say, you know what, like, let's embrace, like, let's go in for a hug for a second. Let's just hold each other for a second. Let each other know that everything is going to be all right. We are on the same team. We are working through these things, even when it comes to intimacy. Unfortunately, we often put our spouse in the opposite corner of ourselves as if they are the enemy. What we need to do is say, actually, we're on the same side. We're both trying to improve intimacy. Like, let's work on this together. Let's be on the same team. And so the way we do this is we don't realize that if we just hug each other for a minute, 2 minutes, you can physically feel your body release that contraction, right? That tension. And I love to just really hold that hug until I can feel either myself finally release it, or I can feel my husband like release. And I'm like, oh, there it is, right? Because as we do that, guess what goes inside? Mental medication. In that process, we actually start to create new thoughts, positive thoughts, wonderful thoughts about ourselves, about our spouse, about the marriage, us being there for one another. That is the mental medicine that we need. Now our body is ready for intimacy. We have induced intimacy by going through these simple steps. You can see these steps are not like, oh, this is going to take 5 hours and I'm going to have to put in like so much effort. Once we know the steps is probably the biggest hurdle, right? Knowing the steps and just putting them into place, that's the easier part. So again, if husbands can ask, right? What do you need right now, right? If let's say they're hugging, okay, what do you need right now? Is there anything I can do? But also the wife can advocate. Oh, I just need to light some candles right now. I just need to take 10 deep breaths. I need to relax my body. I need to listen to some music, right? We can advocate in that moment. And husbands can advocate for their wife's arousal as well, right? What do you want me to do? Lay it on me, woman. I will light that fire. I'll light that candle. I'm going to put some sexy music on. I am happy to do those things, right? We both can advocate for creating a mood, creating the scene that actually is like, yes, I want to have sex in this environment. Yeah, could be amazing. So if any of these things are like resonating with you and you're like, man, I'm really struggling with that. It makes sense, but I don't know how to actually do that. Please get on my website and sign up for a free discovery session with me. It's at shelly.andersoncoaching.com. It's very easy to just get on my schedule and let's discuss this. Let's form something new. Let's birth the sexiness. Let's induce something that's fun, lively, energetic, and romantic. Because remember, the more you restore this type of intimacy with yourself, the more you restore it with your spouse. Thank you so much for listening today, and I hope you will join me again next week.